Good evening. It is Monday, April 22nd, 2019. This is a special meeting for the City of Woodland, Washington Council. If I can please get everyone to please silence your cell phones at this time and stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. The flag is to our right, your left. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Mrs. Ripp, will you please take the roll?
Councilmember Chapman?
Here.
Councilmember Humbert?
Here.
Councilmember Fredericks?
Here.
Councilmember Graham?
Here.
Councilmember Plaza?
Here.
Councilmember Rounds?
Here.
Councilmember Benjamin?
Here.
All right, all council members are accounted for. Before we get started this evening, this is a special meeting, but we did have some unusual circumstances that took place on April 15th during a regular council meeting. Unfortunately, we had a medical emergency and we were forced to cancel that meeting on the 15th. At this time, we did bring those items back forward for council consideration under all consent items. Now, I realize that there may be some discussion on some of those items, and I ask that if you do want to discuss them, council, someone on council, please pull that and push it to the May 6th meeting so we can get on with our agenda this evening. So at this time, I've got consent items A through G.
Move to approve is presented.
Oh. Second.
Oh, stand by, go back. We need agenda approval, sorry.
Oh.
I'm off my game where this isn't our normal venue here.
Move to approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
Moved by Councilmember Humberg, seconded by Councilmember Plaza. Will the clerk please take the vote? Apologize for that.
Councilmember Chapman?
Aye.
Councilmember Humbert?
Aye.
Councilmember Fredericks?
Aye.
Councilmember Graham?
Aye.
Councilmember Plaza?
Aye.
Councilmember Rounds?
Aye.
Councilmember Benjamin?
All right, the agenda's been approved. Moving back forward to consent items A through G.
Move to adopt consent items A through G.
Second.
Moved by Councilmember Fredericks, seconded by Councilmember Humberg. Will the clerk please take the vote?
Councilmember Fredericks?
Aye.
Councilmember Chapman?
Aye.
Councilmember Benjamin? Councilmember Graham?
Aye.
Councilmember Plaza?
Aye.
Councilmember Humbert?
Aye.
Councilmember Rounds?
Aye.
Consent items A through G have passed. At this time, I'm going to ask that council move to the front row as we call Mr. Goddard forward for a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My name is Travis Goddard. For the record, I am the Community Development Director for the City of Woodland. And the presentation that I will be doing tonight is for Comp Plan Amendment 2018 number 10. And that is the docket map of recommendations from the City Council. So I wanted to start out by pointing out that all of the information from the Comprehensive Plan Map Amendment cases are available online at the Community Development Comprehensive Plan webpage, which is shown here, and then the individual documents for all of the various cases are listed down below. So any information that we're discussing tonight You will be able to find that information on the website. As a refresher, this is a comprehensive plan map that was adopted with the March 2016 comp plan amendment or adoption. And you can see that the blue is the industrial areas, the pink is the commercial, the yellow is residential, and then the green is essentially the public facilities designations in the city. So we only have those 4 basic designations. I would also like to point out that the majority of the information that we've been using to have this discussion is found in Table 3.1 of the Comprehensive Plan, and it's the planning assumptions and targets for our 20-year growth program or planning horizon. And it starts with the information up top, our current population and what we expected the population growth to be, an additional 3,566 for a total of 9,274 by 2036. And using a growth rate of 2.3%, this is the existing number of housing units that were available in 2016 based upon 2015 numbers. And this is the residential distribution that we expected in 20 years. This is the 60% low density, 40% high density housing units that we will be talking about. And then the job estimates based upon the amount of commercial land that's available and industrial land that's available is this information here. And I emphasize this because in 2015, the comprehensive plan was adopted and it was not challenged, and it is the comprehensive plan and the growth projections and the growth assumptions that we are currently using. What we are discussing is the map that implements what was adopted in 2016. So none of these numbers necessarily are going to be changed based upon where we expect to be in 20 years. So again, those planning assumptions and targets, the commercial property, 124 acres, we expected to have about 2,480 jobs come out of those 124 acres. Industrial, 548 acres, and that will be about 2,192 jobs, industrial. And then on the residential side, 174 acres, and we expected 1,292 units. Now, Table 3.1 specifically says we expect 619 high-density units and 673 low-density units. And what I wanted to point out at this point is the comprehensive plan talks about high density and low density. And the terms I'm going to be talking about a lot are single-family residential and multi-family residential. The way our zoning code works is there is a minimum lot size, let's say, for example, an 8,500 square foot lot. You can have front yards, side yards, rear yards, and your setbacks would allow you to build a single-family home, maybe a duplex home, on a lot. Whereas when you get into the medium and the high-density zoning district, the lots can be so small that you can't fit a single-family home on it. And multifamily residential is actually a building term which says if there's more than 4 units in a single structure, it is built to the multifamily code. So when we talk about high-density housing, we're really talking about buildings where there's more than 4 units in a single building, whether it's like the townhomes that people call the birdhouses off of Lewis River Road, since there's more than 4 of them in a row. Those are called multifamily housing, even though each individual condominium owner owns the lot and the unit that they live in. So they may think of it as a single family in each condominium, but the building structure is a multifamily structure, as opposed to apartments, which might be something that somebody typically thinks of as a multifamily dwelling unit. The reason why we're having this conversation, and I just wanted to throw this map in there because you might have seen this before, this represents our 2018 building activity, and this was based on August of 2018. So the pink is commercial development that we had received applications on. The blue is industrial applications that we've received applications on. The yellow is residential. This corresponds to the comprehensive coloring. But the reason why I threw this in is these red stars represent applications for development that have occurred since August. So in the first 8 months, that's the pink and the blue and the yellow, and the red stars are development that's occurred in the last 8 months since the first map was produced. So it shows that the city is growing at a relatively rapid rate in the last year and a half. Actually, it's the last 3 years since the comp plan was updated. So let's focus on the commercial for a couple minutes. There's 124 acres. That's what the 2015-2016 number was. We've had 15 approved projects that have consumed 33.68 acres. That's 27% of the commercial property that was available in 2016 has been developed. There's also 2 additional projects that are in review, 18 acres. That's about another 14%. So what that says is after three years, almost 4 years of development, we've had approximately 42% of our commercial land has been consumed with projects that have been proposed. So thinking of a 20-year comprehensive planning horizon, each one of those years represents about 5% of the timeline. So we're actually consuming our commercial land at about 10% per year instead of 5% per year. Now, the commercial impacts of the effort that we've recently gone through to discuss the comprehensive plan changes. So here's the planning assumption, 124 acres. We developed 33, which gives us 90. That's the percentage that's remaining. This year, we expect about another 18 acres of development, which puts us at the 58%. Now, the Planning Commission reviewed 3 applications for internal changes, Saxony Pacific Franklin Loop, the Byung RV property, and the Woodland Commerce Center, 19.5 acres, 6.3 acres, and 5.5 acres. So they recommended approval of those 3 projects. They also recommended approval of expansion of the urban growth boundary to include potentially 2 properties. That's property down by Ajo at the south end of town, and then the Loomis Empress Estates. And that number is actually out of date, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But with the additions of additional commercial land, what it does is it actually kind of recharges our commercial supply. That's what this slide represents. So we had 100%, we've been developing. The changes reduce it to a pretty significant amount, but by expanding the urban growth boundary, the city will be able to recapture some future commercial growth. Now the one exception to that is a lot of the land that is in the urban growth area and projected for commercial development includes Double J Trailers south of town, Woodland Pallet south of town, and then the, I think it's the Put It In storage area south of town. So although there is additional area that could become part of the growth area, it's not necessarily vacant developable land. So the acreage is not necessarily equal acre for acre. So on the industrial side, there's 548 acres in the comprehensive plan projections. We've had 11 projects that have consumed 84.0 acres of that, and that's about 15% of the supply. We have 5 additional projects in the planning process for another 65 acres. So that's about 11.9% that probably will get development permits by the end of 2019, which leaves us a remaining capacity of about 72%. Now, what this number also shows us is that our industrial development is accelerating, and it's occurring at about 7 to 8% per year, as opposed to the 5% each year of our planning horizon. So again, same exercise, started with 548. We've developed some, and we're at about 72% of our supply. There also is going to be a minor reduction due to the Franklin Loop recommendation and a minor addition due to the Trevor Beatty redesignation. And then the expansion of the UGA would include some additional industrial land, and that includes the area that's known as Waltz Meats, White Timber Trucking, and Geronimo Painting. And also the Thoney Farm, which I will get to a little bit later, also would be added to the urban growth boundary if that's the direction you choose to go. So again, here we are, current levels, we've developed some. There's not going to be a major impact due to comprehensive plan proposals, and the expansion of the growth area could add a little additional land that's not currently available. So on the residential side, which is the third category that we're going to talk about, I'm going to go back and forth between acreage and units. So the number of acres that was in the comprehensive plan doesn't necessarily equal the number of units, because multifamily develops at about 20 units per acre, and single-family residential will develop about 4 units per acre. So I want to focus on the units for a minute, because we talked about 1,292. That was our target or expected growth by 2036, and we expected a distribution of high density and low density. The problem is that the number of units that we have actually constructed in 16, 17, 18, and so far in 19 is we've only built 8 of the multifamily units, which means we built about 1% of our multifamily goal. But our single family, we've already developed 18% of our single family goal. So what it means is that we are vastly outstripping our single family goal, but underdeveloping our multifamily goal. And this gives you an idea of the numbers that have been developed 2016, 17, 18. These are the number of units that were constructed. In 2019, we have had 0 residential building permits issued in 2019. So this trend is actually looking like it's continuing to go down, because we didn't create any additional residential lots last year. We created 3, and they all pulled building permits in 2018. So now we're going to look at acres really quickly. Gross land available, the 174 acres that was the inventoried residential land in the comprehensive plan, I was trying to figure out exactly where that number came from, and I couldn't find it. So I actually had to go out and do a door-to-door drive-by windshield survey to see what was out there and what was available, and I used mapping resources. And what I found is that we actually have 141 acres that looks like it's developable within the city limits. Within the Cowlitz County UGA, there's 47, and Clark County inside Horseshoe Lake, there's 82 acres that's available. But that's a gross number. When you actually look at, when you separate out the amount of land that you will need for roads, plus wetlands and areas that you can't actually build, the actual developable number, the net number, is quite a bit lower. And so I did a couple things. I looked at the gross units. So if 144 acres, if we were able to build from fence post to fence post with homes, we would be able to achieve about 1,397 units if all we built was multifamily dwellings. So within the city limits, we could accommodate our goal of 1,292 if we chose to build nothing but high-density housing within the land that's available in the city. And looking at the net, so really 63 acres is usable. If I run the numbers out, that's about the number that you could get using different calculations and set-asides for wetlands and roads. The other exercise that I did, and that is I counted the practical number of units that could actually be developed in the city. And part of that is, let's say, for example, the Promise Church. They have some large pieces of property, and it is entirely possible that they could bulldoze the church and build multifamily housing, but I think that's unlikely. So using my best professional judgment, I can actually count all of that acreage and say that it's likely going to result in 0 residential units because the church is unlikely to go away and replace itself with housing. So the actual practical number of units that could occur is a lot lower than in this perfect world if you had an engineer and no wetlands and he was willing to design 20 units per acre. We could accommodate our future growth, but it doesn't seem likely. So we're looking at how to potentially add this 33 acres represents the request for changes to their comprehensive plan designation. And this 272 represents the property owners who have requested to become part of the city urban growth boundary. And so by adding up these numbers, what I could figure out is we are about 810 units short, so we're about 70% below actually achieving our 20-year goal. And we're 3 years into the comprehensive planning window. So it looks kind of bleak, which is why we've been going through this process and having this discussion so far. So looking at the internal changes that have been requested, as I mentioned, there's 3 requests, Franklin Loop, B. Young RV, and Woodland Commerce Center. You can see the acreage here, so 33.5 acres, the gross number of units that we could achieve, but the realistic number that we're likely to get out of these 3 proposals is in the neighborhood of 490 units. So that actually gets us 38% of the way to our goal by redesignating these 3 proposals. And I'll get to those individually in a couple minutes. The Uga expansions that have been discussed are Saxony Pacific Dike Access across the street from the high school. It's 16 acres. The Gehry Loomis Empress Estates proposal north of town. It's about 30 acres. And Ajo Construction, the recommendation was about 160 acres south of town. And the Planning Commission also recommended that we include some of the property between the Ajo proposal and the city limits, just so we eliminate the Swiss cheese holes that we had been discussing early on in the process. And using an estimate of single-family residential densities, which are likely to occur on these 3 properties, we can achieve the growth target that we were looking at, which is another 900 units, plus some of the market factor. Now, the market factor, realistically, when planners are looking at projects, we recognize that there's always property on the market, and as soon as one piece sells, another piece comes up on the market. It just kind of it's a revolving door, and houses come on the market and they get sold again. So typically there is about a 20% market factor in planning, and this allows us to achieve our goals within 20 years, plus we'll have a little bit extra, assuming that the real estate market is going to continue to evolve over the next 20 years. Now, as I mentioned before, so the 1292 with the market factor means we're looking at about 1,550 units. So internally, we get about 490 of high density, and we're going to get about 660 low density, maybe 236 on top of that, which gets us in the neighborhood of exactly, that's about the ballpark of what we were looking to expect within the next 20 years. So let's talk about the individual cases. Saxony Pacific, this is Belmont Loop, if you're familiar, and Franklin Street comes off, it's a southern stub. And then it also includes a long skinny property that comes out to Old Pacific Highway, and it's owned by a single owner, 19.5 acres of commercial and 2.56 acres of industrial. What the Planning Commission recommended is that it go to residential, and not only that it go to residential, but that it be zoned medium density residential and that it develop at approximately 20 units per acre. So this is part of those 490 units that we had mentioned, or that I had mentioned previously. The next property is Saxony Pacific. This is their dike access project, same company, but different project, high school. This is the old spool factory in the field back behind it. This one is encumbered with some critical areas. There's some creek and some wetlands identified. So The 16.22 acres is gross, and the Planning Commission recommended that we extend the urban growth boundary to include it as a residential. And you'll notice on this map that actually the Planning Commission recommended that we just extend the urban growth boundary. This is the current city boundary and the growth boundary. They recommended that we include it out to Burke, and we'll get into that in a couple more minutes. But it gives you an idea of what the Planning Commission has recommended to you. Now this site, you'll recognize that the primary thing you notice is the Saxony Pacific site. This slide is actually for the Trevor Beatty site. It is a small single-family residential lot with a shop, and he had been previously operating a business out of there. And through code enforcement efforts, he ended up moving his business to Battleground and the 8 jobs in his business. And you'll notice that that site has been much cleaner since he moved. But in working with him, we come to the realization that it actually makes sense for that to be converted to a residential, or I'm sorry, from a residential to a light industrial, and the Planning Commission agreed. So the light industrial district would be extended from across the street to include that property. And Mr. Beatty has indicated that he would actually remove the existing shop, remove the residence, and he would plan to redevelop it and bring it up to the light industrial code. So he would screen his outside storage, he would put in parking, he would put in landscaping, and a new building that would allow him to enter and exit the building without actually having to pull out into the old Pacific right-of-way. So that was his request, and the zoning recommendation for that is light industrial. The Gehry Loomis Empress Estates. So this is the original application. It involved yellow stars represent the individual properties that requested to go residential, and this parcel was recommended to go commercial. He actually has a small developable area at the foot of the hill that is accessed from Old Pacific Highway, and he had requested commercial on that corner, but I had recommended that the entire site be commercial because there are issues when we split zone property or split designate property. It creates problems when we're actually doing permitting. So that was the original process. The initial Planning Commission recommendation was that it be included in the urban growth boundary, but based upon public input at the Planning Commission hearings, the neighbors had brought up a bunch of issues, including the fact that any development that were to occur at the top of the hill would be accessing gravel county roads, and there's no way for the city to influence the impacts to the county infrastructure. The final recommendation by the Planning Commission is that we work out with Mr. Loomis the area at the bottom of the hill that is commercially developable, and that he would be able to include that commercial property in the city boundary. And he is currently working with the owners of this property to potentially acquire that developable commercial property. So if he can work something out with them, that would be the recommendation, that we expand the growth area to include the commercial property, but that instead of including the growth area, urban growth boundary to include these properties, that instead that staff would work with him to determine whether or not it's feasible to extend city water out to the houses or the lots that currently do not have access to water. So I think that the Planning Commission agrees that that would be a better solution. This again was due to the input and the concerns by the neighbors to the north. There's also the issue of whether or not it would be feasible for the city to get a water system that meets city standards, because our minimum standard is a 6-inch pipe, and the actual design and engineering would require a pumping station to a cistern mid-hill, and then that cistern would have to again pump it to the top of the hill, and there would be some kind of storage structure at the top of the hill. So it's almost cost prohibitive for the city to build a 6-inch water system that meets our standards to the top of the hill, whereas a private extension Mr. Loomis could install a 1-inch or a 2-inch pipe, and it's feasible to pump that high enough so that it would supply water to a couple residences or his lot at the top of the hill, which was his original stated desire. So this is a significant reduction from what the applicant actually requested and what the Planning Commission recommended for you. This is the Bruce Young, or the B. Young RV site. This is Cherry Blossom, the existing street that ends in a hammerhead here. This is a boundary line adjustment that was completed late 2018, and it doesn't actually show on the GIS system because the assessor hasn't updated their maps yet. But this is actually the shape of the lot that we are discussing, and it includes a street connection out to Atlantic. And he has requested residential, and the Planning Commission agreed that it does present a good high-density residential. So again, they recommended medium-density residential, about 20 units per acre. And this yellow area is the existing residential on Cherry Blossom plus the apartments here. Woodland Commerce Center. So if you're familiar with the CC Street Bridge, here's the AMPM, here's the city Wastewater Treatment Plant, exit 21. So it's 5.52 acres on the Lewis River, and the Planning Commission agreed that it was fitting for a residential designation, and they also wanted the medium-density residential designation, and the applicant has a preliminary plan that shows some kind of condominium-style buildings. So the Planning Commission agreed that this site was fitting for residential development. Still has the residential portion that was approved under a previous site plan, and it includes a road approach up to CC Street. So it will be an elevated ramp type structure, so we'll be able to route a lot of the traffic away from the connection here. We'll be able to go up and actually enter at the top of the hill on the CC Street Bridge. So that development of this site will actually significantly increase the traffic flow and the safety issues that are associated with the current driveway that's there. And lastly, this is the Ajo Construction Proposal. The original proposal was for 605 acres. And then one of the property owners who was participating in the application withdrew these portions of the property, and they've since applied for a subdivision in Cowlitz County. So that's not part of our consideration anymore. So it's 438 acre request after withdrawal. And the Planning Commission recommended this. So you'll recognize here's Pinkerton and the intersections by Waltz Meats. So the green area represents the portion of the Ajo request down to Wyman Road, and they wanted a line drawn along Wyman Road to the railroad tracks and everything north brought in. So when I talk about this is the application parcels in dark green, and this is the included area that kind of got swept up to prevent the Swiss cheese holes between the Ajo property or the Donald Ferguson property and the current city limits. So the new boundary would come down the train tracks, and actually it would come down on the east side, not down the middle of the train tracks. Across here, include Pekin Road, South Pekin Road, and then coming along the bottom of the Ferguson property and then back out to the middle of the river, and this would match our current urban growth area just off the top of the screen there. The reason why this slide is in here is because it points out that the entire inclusion is 326 acres, but not all of that was the Ajo application. Some of the properties were swept up in the urban growth area expansion, and that's the light green stuff. So this slide actually recommends, includes the final recommendation from the Planning Commission, and it includes no planned unit residential development requirement for this area. It includes the whole parcels. When they had drawn the first line from here across, some of these parcels included some property in and some property out. And the problem, of course, is once this line cut those properties in half, these portions on the south side had no access because they currently are accessed as part of the farms that front on either Pekin or Wayland Road. So they included, at staff's suggestion, that they included the entire parcels that had been previously split. And it represents about 194 acres of applicant property, again, about 127 acres of non-applicant property, and then also some commercial and industrial inclusions. So the recommendations that also came from the Planning Commission, I'll go over these slide by slide. So again, they recommended not only bringing in the dike access property for Saxony Pacific, but also the neighboring properties, because it doesn't make sense for us to have this key-shaped part sticking out into the county, and it makes sense for it to go to Burke Road. The second one that they included, and that is the Thoney Farm includes all of this property here. And for some reason, when the city was having its original conversation about including the farm, not all of the parcels were included, and we're not sure exactly how it happened, but they requested that we just simply include this last piece that was in the county. So for expediency of having it in a single jurisdiction, that's what this property represents, and it's 31 acres, industrial zoning. The other one, as I mentioned, was a small portion in the south corner here. So they changed from recommending the entire Loomis inclusion to just a portion of it. The 5 parcels that had been split, as you'd seen before. And then the last recommendation that the Planning Commission had, and this is the low-density, high-density distribution that's in our comprehensive plan. We have a stated policy of 60 low-density, 40% high-density. And they recommended a 75-25 because it's consistent with the majority of jurisdictions in our region, whether it's Clark County, whether it's La Center, whether it's Ridgefield, I believe Camas, and even Cowlitz County has my understanding, testimony was that all those jurisdictions have a 75-25 high-density, low-density split. So the feeling is that it is not necessarily in the city's policies, in the rest of the policies, that the 60-40 split is almost inconsistent with the other stated policies in the comprehensive plan. And they felt this better reflected the city's desired growth pattern, as opposed to all multifamily to achieve our target goals. So in summary, the commercial, you have about 30 of it that's lost to residential development. You have about 60 acres that's added through the various growth boundary expansions. Actually, it's more like 35 net increase. Industrial, a little bit of loss due to redesignation, but some of that is captured by expansion. And then residential, we have some internal additions by redesignation and some external addition by expansion of the growth boundary. So at this point, that kind of gets you a little bit of a background of how the Planning Commission got to its conclusions. And I'd like to point out that your next step, that the City Council is under no obligation to take the recommendations of the Planning Commission, that you can do essentially, use your legislative authority to do what you would like. You can adopt the internal only changes. That's one idea, one option that you have. You could adopt the urban growth area expansions, but it is subject to county approval. The city does not have the authority under RCWs to designate urban growth boundaries. The RCW and the Growth Management Act specifically vests that right or that responsibility with the county. So whatever you do, it would have to go to Cowlitz County as a urban growth boundary expansion request, and I would have to act on the city's behalf to apply for a change to the county comprehensive plan. And so because you desire to expand the urban growth boundary, there's no guarantee that the county would approve it, because ultimately they decide what our urban growth boundaries look like. The other thing is you can request amendments of the county comprehensive plan theoretically before change is adopted. If you believe that we've made good progress, but you don't believe that we're ready to actually implement the external urban growth boundary expansion, you could always ask me to apply, and then we could work through that process and see what we can work out with the county. That would be an option that you could pursue. You can also choose not to make changes at this time. If you remember back, for those of you who were here for the Glenwood process last year, the decision was made that you were not going to take the property on Glenwood and go from light industrial to residential. And so you essentially opted not to make any changes, and that was the end of the process last year. You could also postpone changes until the development codes are revised. The Planning Commission was a little frustrated during this process because they would like to revisit the planned unit residential development code. They would like to take a look at our zoning and find out whether there are better tools that are available to them. And maybe with better tools, we can achieve our density without having to do massive expansion or without significant redesignation within the city. But beyond the end of that, I needed to point out that there is a 60-day notice to commerce. So regardless of what you decide to do, it wouldn't actually be able to take effect until we can coordinate with the Department of Commerce, and they would have the opportunity to review and determine whether it's consistent with RCWs and commerce policies. So we're still a little bit away of the end of the process, but ultimately you're going to need to give me some direction how you would like to proceed at this point. Any questions? I think so. Yep.
All right, we'll, does anybody need a break before we pop back up there? No? Okay, we'll pop back up in our seats then. Thank you, Mr. Goddard. Don't go too far, Mr. Goddard. Where's Melissa? She's still here. Is there another sheet? I should have grabbed it, sorry. Take their seats here. One more sheet here. Okay, so with this meeting this evening, this was not something, I just want to make it clear, this was not a required meeting. This was in addition to give council an opportunity to hear from the community this evening, to see a presentation from Mr. Goddard, and have one more opportunity for the community to step forward for those that perhaps maybe missed some of the first meetings or did not have an opportunity to provide thoughts and opinions or testimony. We do have some folks that have signed in outside in the lobby there. Does council want to ask questions of Mr. Goddard, or would you like to go into public testimony first and then ask questions of Mr. Goddard?
Let's do the public
I'd like to go
testimony.
to public testimony first and then.
Okay, and then move forward. Okay, it looks like there's a few that are still trickling in, so we may have some more. Could I just get a show, we've got a lot of information that came in from those that are here this evening. Can I get a show of hands of how many want to speak this evening? Okay. I think 5 minutes is probably appropriate at this time. It's still early on, and it doesn't look like we have a ton of folks. So I'll start going down the list and asking you to step forward to the microphone, and I'll allow 5 minutes for you to speak to council. Council, there will be no interaction between you and council. This is public testimony only. Please, if there are any questions, direct those towards me. Linda Owens.
Mr. Mayor, can you maybe speak for a couple more minutes so that we
Okay,
can
until
make
we
sure
get started?
that...
Absolutely.
Can you hear us now?
Don't hear anything yet? That's fine. Keep talking. That's fine. Can you hear me now? You can hear me now? Perfect. Thank you. All right. Here we go. Okay. Linda Owens. Chris, is it Bottmiller? If you hear your name, please step forward. Miss Jennifer Ray Keene. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's Mrs. Jennifer Ray Keene.
Either way is fine. Jennifer Ray Keene with the Port of Woodland. Just some items I would like to make sure that the city council addresses is transportation. Obviously, we've heard of that. But my concern is directly with Wayland Road. As we have more development happening with, if you approve the Ajo construction, as well as with the feasibility study of the 460 acres, where is that traffic going to go? Where is the truck traffic going to go? That's a concern for the port of where we're going to direct. Is it exit 22, exit 21? So just really taking a hard look at that one. Not just the residential. We understand there's going to be a lot of growth there, but with the 460 acres, that's potentially 3,000 jobs that could be coming in and out each day into our community. So as much as we would like that residential to be here, we know that there's jobs that people have outside the community. So what communication is there with Wayland Road, make sure we do not have another at-grade crossing with that being a main line for Burlington Northern? So, thank you.
Thank you. Miss Megan Evans. That's right. We just had the one sign up. Are you wanting to speak this evening?
Actually, I have some questions, so.
Okay.
So I believe it was at Travis's last meeting, and he said something about how impact fees would be gathered from the developers that would build residences. But from what I understand, isn't X21 like under DOT jurisdiction? Or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
So those impact fees wouldn't be able to be used for the exit 21, which is the issue. So I
A
guess-
portion of them we can use for transportation, which it's within the city,
Okay.
so we can apply some of those impact fees to the project at 21, yes.
Okay. So I guess I'm just wondering, how is the city gonna get the money to fix the intersection? Because the thing that I've heard, the only thing I've really heard was there's a study that's being done, but other than that, I haven't really heard anything. So I'm just kind of wondering if there's anything else maybe I didn't hear that's going on with how to fix that, if there's any solutions with the exit or the intersection in general.
You want me to answer that for you right now?
Sure.
Okay, if you allow me just a few moments here. So currently, right now, the city is in the process of a study/design with community involvement with Exit 21. We've just begun that, and we hope that by the end of the year, we'll have the community engagement portion of that done, and the design will come forward so we can then go to engineering. At this point, we do have a little over $1 million that has been granted to us through a few different entities to make that study happen and to get that design process and the community engagement portion completed. As far as construction, that's a whole different topic, and we can't go out for construction dollars until we have the design that is already there.
Okay. I just feel like, at least for me, and I'm not sure about, any other public, citizens, I'm not sure if, I feel like there's a lot of information that might be missing. I mean, like, for instance, you said that, there's $1 million already saved up. I had no idea that was even, there. So I guess with, all the residences that might be built, I just feel like there needs to be more discussion and information being provided.
Okay.
So that's it.
Thank you. Is it Skip Erling? Euling? Erling.
Do you need my address?
Please just state your name. I should have had the others do that as well. I apologize. Yes.
No, it's fine. Skip Early. And I'm representing the Woodland Commerce Center. This is a project that's been going on for 12 or 13 years now. They've not been able to come to any fruition with getting commercial development into the properties, and Lord knows they've been trying. But they thought that maybe doing some type of medium-density townhouse development would be viable on that particular properties, with the attraction of the river being right there. We're very happy with the Planning Commission's recommendation for both the comp plan map as well as the medium-density zoning. We'd ask that you consider not requiring a planned unit residential development as the mechanism for subdividing the property. It's cumbersome. It seems to work better in more highly developed, dense areas like Vancouver and Portland. There was also one comment by one of the Planning Commission members that they were looking to get an extra layer of review on the project, and that's why he was pushing for the PURD. I don't know if he was aware, but this is also a shoreline property, and it's the only shoreline property among the 8 or 9 applications that came in this year. And so there will be extra review through that process. So we ask that the PURD condition go away.
All right. Thank you, sir. Mr. Bob Foss.
Hi, I'm Bob Foss. Live at 670 South Beacon Road. Thanks for your time here tonight. I'm against the urban growth boundary on southeast side of Woodland Bottoms. This land was diked in the early 20s and has been recognized all through Washington and the Northwest as prime sandy loam soil. There are a few places in the Northwest that have soil like this. It has been reclaimed from the Columbia and the Lewis rivers by diking the bottoms. Cowlitz County said in a letter in January that 65% of all agriculture in the county is grown here. There's a lot more to agriculture than dairy farms and tulips. These farmers not only want to sell their land, but want to make sure that no one will ever farm it again by planting houses on it. And I don't think that's quite right. Selling it to a developer to do it. In January, a few of us went out door to door for signatures of people against growth in the bottoms. We gathered over 600 signatures in a few days before a January Planning Commission meeting. Both city and county residences were against it, with only a few wanting more information. Stuck. Okay, here we go. This will totally change the face of Woodland. Why can't the city and the county work together to represent the current citizens of the area to keep the quality of life that we have here now? To me, this is a money grab by city and county and 3 farmers that we all will pay for in the end with taxes, bonds, and lifestyle that we have today that we will lose. The long-term effects of short-sighted solutions. You might build houses, but you won't build community if this happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Foss. Dave, is it Westham? Westroy.
Good evening, Dave Weston.
Weston, thank you.
I'd just like to recommend, as Travis mentioned, the council take a look at the 75-25 versus the 60-40 split that's currently in the comp plan. I do believe that it would be in the city's best interest to go to the 75-25 single-family, multifamily. That's more consistent with your neighboring communities. And also, if you look at the growth that Travis showed, you're already even lower than the 75-25 in the last 3-4 years. So I would definitely recommend at least considering that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ken Clark. Julie Clark. Darlene Johnson. Thank you.
Darlene Johnson. I also echo what the person just before me said, is that we need to go to the 25-75. And actually I looked it up, it looks to me as if, and I'm not an expert on this, that it was changed in 2016. And I don't think anybody realized what that change would do. And I think all the calculations that have been done indicating we need more high density are done based on that particular percentage. And I think they should be completely redone based on that. I think it is only logical that we be the same as all the surrounding areas. And so I think any calculation should be based on that percentage with the hope that you guys will approve that change in the percentage. Then we've got, as people have said, we've got a traffic issue, and adding a lot of more residentials to an area that already has a failed intersection at exit 21. When we have Woodland Truck Line, we're on Sherman Way, and there's many times during the day that you can't even get out of our facility. That is not good for attracting industry, and industry has good paying jobs. Everything that I see that is going from either commercial or industrial to residential, saying Woodland wants to be a bedroom community. I don't think Woodland wants to be a bedroom community. I don't want it to be a bedroom community, because bedroom communities never can pay for the services that they demand. You need a lot of industry, you need good paying jobs, you need commercial. That's what pays the way. Residents have never paid the way, and you can look all throughout the state of Washington, and if anybody finds one community where residents actually pay their way, I'd be interesting to look into those statistics. So we need to change our goal. We need to fix the traffic, and I've testified before that we really need to revise the code that the city has before we do an extension or take in more areas for residential. And I think that we need to solve our traffic problem also. And without doing those things, I think the county has even indicated we shouldn't be doing a lot of expansion because of the traffic issues that we currently have. One thing that I've heard people say, we need more residential because we're going to have all these jobs. Well, if you don't solve the traffic problem and you don't create it more beneficial for industry to come here, you're not going to have those jobs. We're going to become a bedroom community, and then everybody's going to be working out of town. There's a lot of people currently that are working out of town that would love to work here, and not have that commute, especially if they're going to Oregon because of the income tax issue. And yet, we're not working hard enough. I don't feel that we're working hard enough to provide enough industrial lands that is ready to go for industry to come here. And commercial, I agree with too. And I think there's one land that is going from in residential, commercial. I can support that, but all the rest of them is the other way. And I just think that is not a good way for Woodland to go. I've testified quite a few times on that issue, and it seems like you keep just banging your head against the wall. But, you know, industry and commercial pays the way. You can have good schools, you can have good police protection, you can actually have good roads. And you're not going to do that with just increasing the residential area.
Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. Kara Seaman? Did I get that right? Okay. I'll get you to state your name for me, please.
Kara Seaman.
Kara, sorry.
Thank you for the opportunity to chat. I did give this testimony to the Planning Commission, and I'm going to give it again to you because I want you to hear it from me. I'm not sure if you have an opportunity to go back and review those tapes. At the Planning Commission meeting, and this was not directed at me, but it was directed at someone else who was speaking before the Planning Commission, and Tel Jensen said to this person something to the effect of, well, I'm not really interested in what you have to say or what your needs are. This has to be of interest to the city. And that kind of resonated with me for a little bit because I've been a member of the community for 17 years. That's not an old timer by any means, but certainly long enough to be considered a valuable member of this community. So I happen to live in the proposed inclusion zone down on South Pekin. I have a 2-acre parcel of land that is currently surrounded by Ferguson. And when I bought that property, I was very much seeking the lifestyle to be able to farm. So 2 acres is not a lot compared to what Ferguson has, and at the time I bought, I was surrounded by his cows. And I certainly never thought that that property would be turned into residences. I thought as Class A agricultural land, it would be preserved. So even if at some point Ferguson, whom I know, decided to sell, it would be sold to somebody else who would be using the land as is. So the concern that I have here is that with this proposed housing development, it is threatening the quality of life that I purchased. So I'd really like to investigate whether there could be other purchasers for that property. And like a previous person said, once that land is paved, it's gone forever. But again, back to what I'm interested in, because that's why I'm testifying, I never had any desire to live urban. I drive a tractor. I burn multiple times a year. If you've driven by my property, you'll see the many historic trees on my property. I have 3 of the oldest trees of their particular species in Cowlitz County, and they drop limbs all the time. I happen to know that if I am in the city, I will no longer be able to burn unless there's some special considerations for those of us that are continue our farming way of life. So I hope that is going to be addressed. And am I going to still be able to drive my tractor and farm my land? These are my rights. And again, I know I'm the small underdog in this fight, but I have to keep testifying and testifying because this is where I raised my children. My children went to school right here, and I had planned to retire here. And my vision was to be able to sit on my patio and look at the wonderful vista and continue my farming. With houses coming in, that's all changed. As you know, if you live in the city, you get barking dogs, you have neighbors playing loud music at all opportunities. So it's just changing that quality of life. So I'd like to know what that would look like for those of us that are still there. There are not very many of us that are in this inclusion zone, but I'd like to know what will happen. I'm also a little concerned that my taxes are going to increase when I'm in the city limits, and I'm concerned about being priced out of my home because my income isn't going to raise. I don't know how much the city taxes would be, but I am concerned about it. And I'd like to know what benefit I get from those taxes. I'm currently on well and sewer, and I would like to retain those opportunities. I bought there knowing I had that. Am I going to be forced to hook up to the city? Hopefully not. That's a huge expense, which would probably lead to me having to leave my investment. And I know I will have access to police and fire services, but what else am I going to get for those taxes? So I'm not opposed to the idea of the land being sold, but I am very concerned, as someone else stated, about the current residents, those of us that have been around for a long time, being negatively affected by this decision. And I hope that if this particular plan is enacted, that there be steps taken to ensure that our quality of life is not diminished. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been an hour. It's 7:06. Let's just get through this sheet here and then we can go. Keith Pfeiffer? Thank you. David Seaman? Okay. Kim Everett, or is it Everest?
Hello,
And can you state your name for the record, please?
Kim Everett.
Thank you.
Anyway, it's been changed, but there you go. I am also one of those residents in the inclusion area, and I'm nervous at public speaking, so I'm going to read what I wrote. I also testified several times, and some of this is similar and some of it is new. You've heard our concerns about traffic, about roads, about crowds, about neighbors, so I'm going to just tell you my story. I'm a fairly new resident to Cowlitz County. I moved to Clark County in '97 and have lived continuously in the area since then. For me, this is a new record. I was raised in an Air Force family, joined the Air Force after college, and married an Air Force member. So before '97, the longest I lived anywhere was 7 years. As a child, we lived overseas twice, and even while in the U.S., on a base in a very small house. So my horse love was contained with books, movies, toys, and occasional riding lessons. Once my son hit 8th grade and started becoming more independent, it became clear that I could do more of what I wanted. I had long since divorced, finished graduate school, and started a new career. Because of my veteran status, I was able to purchase a home. Did you know that this corner of Washington State is a very busy equine community? I ride with the Clark County Fair Mounted Patrol, and I have been on the search and rescue team. My women's riding club supports Whipple Creek Park and has won trophies in the Portland Rose Parade. As I got older, I decided to complete a life goal, my horse in my backyard. So I moved to Cowlitz County and I bought 1 acre because that's what I could afford. I have horses in my backyard that bump up against the Donald farm. They're back there now visiting with the cows. The daily joy is immeasurable. The cost and concern is not. Now my neighboring city, not one I chose to live in, is preparing to include my acre in its boundary. I have concerns. How will my property be impacted? Do you know that vandals go into horse properties and injure the animals? My friends have had their horses' tails cut off. Some have had their horses injured physically because horses are friendly and they walk up to whoever walks in the pasture. I will have 600 homes behind me with people who do not know my animals who can jump the fence. How can I protect them? More concerning, what if the bypass road from Pinkerton to Wayland borders my pasture? If a driver strikes one of my animals, am I liable to the driver? How much is all this going to cost me? I have a well, I have a septic system. It's taken me 2 years to figure it out, but I don't want to hook up to water. I've heard the Woodland water is not any better than my well water. I moved here to retire. If I'm to stay and unwillingly become a Woodland City constituent, how will I be served? Thank you.
Thank you. Lyle Ferguson. Please state your name for the record.
Lyle Ferguson, 1010 Whalen Road. A lot of this is some of these other people covered, but you required Walt's Meats to be inside the city limits, is that right?
They are currently not inside the city limits.
Well, when you required, when they hooked up to their sewer, I thought maybe that's what they was doing. But anyway, I figured if the city was going to influence them, they should have their traffic going through the city instead of past my house. Because if it was a city-sponsored activity there. Anyway, the traffic there on Whalen Road is considerably worse now than it was before. And in these previous meetings, I mentioned about the flood conditions there. Because in the 48 flood, I had water in the upstairs of the house I'm living in right now. And if you're putting a bunch of residents out there in a floodplain, they're liable to get flooded again. Because this flood of 96, we had east part of town got flooded there. And anyway, I'm just concerned about all the extra traffic and nowhere for the traffic to go to get back on the freeway, like I say, all the congestion. But anyway, I don't think we need all these extra residents and people there to cause more traffic problems. Thank you.
And sir, I want to go back to one statement you made about Walt's Meats there. That was an emergency situation. They're not inside the are they inside the urban growth boundary? No. They're receiving city services at this point due to the fact that it was an emergency and they had no services to continue their operation. So we have an agreement with them, just to clarify. Right.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, the time is 7:12. We will take a 8-minute break. All right, it's 7:20. Next up, Mr. Sam Nigro. Oh, is he still here? You switched seats on me. I went right over here and you were gone. All right, please state your name. You've got 5 minutes.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sam Nigro, and I want to speak about, well, first of all, I really don't have a dog in the hunt in all this development in the bottoms, but I appreciate what Mrs. Johnson had to say. What in the world are we going to do with the traffic? I look at the traffic now, and it's laughable, and I don't know how you work your way out of the box that we're in Woodland. I'm concerned myself about the Belmont Loop property, and is it the Saxton development there? We're proposing 345 high-density units that are going to be shoehorned into what is really becoming a small but very successful little business development there on Belmont Loop. I was talking to one of my colleagues who's developing today. He broke ground today, as a matter of fact, and he's putting another little a business building there next to the some that he developed 2 years ago. I purchased a property to build another office. I'm going to hopefully employ 20 more employees there in that office, and that'll be at 1915 Belmont Loop. I own 1925 Belmont Loop and 1930 Belmont Loop. My concern is the increase in crime that is guaranteed going to take place. I mean, this isn't like we have a lot of homes and people are there all the time 24/7. These businesses, you're there 8 to 10 hours a day and then you're gone. And you have 345 units going adjacent to that, as I said, just crammed into the corner in between I-5. One, it's going to look like a dump when people are driving by these apartments next to the interstate. My really, I do have a dog in the hunt as far as the value of our property. I'm concerned about this, not just for myself, but the other business owners. And it could also be tied to the income potential of the area. And quite honestly, if we do move forward with this, I'm going to have second thoughts about really building on another office building in the lot there. Something else that needs to be considered here, you're putting 345 high-density units next to the interstate. Many of these, and I think it's a safe assumption, there's going to be children in it, middle schoolers, high schoolers. Where's the high school? The high school's directly across the interstate. So is Safeway. So is Walmart. There's absolutely no infrastructure for any of these young people to get to Walmart. I know that, heck, I've done it myself. You walk across, Belmont Loop, and you try to get to Walmart, try to get over to the other side, you're taking your life in your own hands. Yeah, if we had an overpass, that would be a good idea, and I would say tie that to it. But I think there's some serious concerns, and Mr. Mayor, I voiced these concerns here a couple of weeks ago, and I think that next day we had a pedestrian hit on I-5, and you very well know what that looks like, hit by 3 cars and then ran over by several semis. You're going to have a problem with youth. And I think that can be backed up if you look at the history of interstates and when you have schools on one side and residential on the other. So that's it. I guess in closing, I would say some goals are not worthy to be met. Who really wants this? I guess I'm asking to really kind of consider that. What's really important to us? And I ask that at least to Belmont Loop and probably the bottoms too, because they're pretty cherished to all of us. Don't make any changes. Sit on it for a while. Don't make any changes necessarily right now, just as you did the last time. Thank you.
Thank you. Jay Peterson? Is that Deanna? Yep. Deanna Holland?
I wasn't really going to do this, but I know you've missed me. So, Deanna Holland.
Please state your name first, and then get started. I'll give you 5 minutes.
Deanna Holland. I think one of the things I wanted to discuss, because I'm one of the people who sit on the freeway taking their life into their own hands trying to get home every night, and I should have sent you guys all pictures because I randomly pull them off my dash cam of me sitting on the freeway, like 10 cars back from the exit. Anywho, and that's my big thing because I really don't want to die trying to come home. The other thing is a lot of the things that the people who live out on the bottoms are talking about, their quality of life. Some of you may have lived here back in the day when all of the newer housing developments on Lewis River Road used to be dairy farms. So across from my house was the slaughterhouse. That's a housing development. Then there was a house, on the other side was another dairy farm. At the end of Gun Club and Insole was a dairy farm. The field, another field that I used to play in when I was a kid is a housing development. The one off of Gun Club now is a housing development. So on my side of town, pretty much every little piece of grass now has a home in it. My neighbor who's sitting back there, I keep reminding her that her house sits on a side yard. It was the yard of some of my neighbors, and 2 houses are now jammed into that. So I kind of have a lot of compassion for the people who live on the bottoms because they didn't move there to have neighbors, really. They have little chunks of land so they can do what they want. And I live in the part of town where it used to be like that, like maybe 20 years ago, I guess. And now all the dairy farms are gone, and I look at houses, and I can't get out of my neighborhood to go to work. And when you guys were putting in the turning lane to go down to Gun Club, that took forever, and if anybody remembers that, it could take you 15 to 20 minutes just to get out of your neighborhood and head out of town. So I kind of feel like if we're gonna have a whole bunch of more housing developments, I trust that all of you will really think about how growth should happen, not so much managing. I know managing growth is kind of a buzzword or buzzwords, but I know that you will really think about this, and I really, really, really hope that you take a long time of thinking about it, because right now it seems like it's a race to hurry this all along for impact fees. And I don't think that that's necessarily the approach. I think it should really be well thought out, because I know for like the last decade, it really hasn't been. It doesn't feel like it has been well thought out. So anyway, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Robin Harrison. Ray, is it Ray or Roy Koistinen? Mr. Jim Johnson? Somebody signed you up. I bet I know who. I can't read the last name. Richard, is it Ombach, or is there a Richard in the house? Yeah. Don't want to speak? Last name starts with an A? Okay. 369 Gun Club. It looks like you signed the paper. Is that Armstrong? Irene?
Irene.
Yes. Do you want to speak this evening?
Well, I'd like to.
Okay.
It'll be a challenge.
That's
Right there.
yeah.
Take the microphone.
Take the
Yeah.
microphone to her.
Irene, just sit there. We'll bring the microphone to you.
Oh, okay.
We'll give you 5 minutes.
Is that all?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, everybody else has addressed transportation, which is the pits here, since I've lived here for 29 years, and lots of the hay fields and all that sort of thing. But I'm mainly concerned whether our treatment plant and our water source would be able to service that many homes, because we get it from the river and it has to be processed, and there's sometimes the river's kind of dry, and we have upgraded the treatment plant where it's better now, or it doesn't overwhelm you with odors as you drive off the freeway. That's an improvement, but I don't know if it would improve. It would need improvement to take care of that many homes in the community. So that's my concern, water and sewer.
Thank you. Martha Billups? Yeah. No? Hope Koistinen?
Hope Koistinen. I've spoken many times at the Planning Commission, but I do want to reiterate what other people have said. This 40/60 is not what we want in Woodland. Please make it 25/75. Please update your codes before you even allow any more development. We need to look at the PURDs. We need to look at what you require a developer to provide for parks. To just give some money for a park and not put a park where the kids are. Take Belmont Loop. Are you going to have a park there for all these kids that would go if it's high-density or medium-density residential. You have no sidewalks to get anywhere from there. You can't get to Walmart or the high school or the middle school or any place if you put in residential there. And please preserve the Woodland Bottoms. I think anybody who's lived in Woodland for any length of time, it's a treasure. And it's not just a treasure for this area, it's statewide. It's prime agricultural land. And we need to preserve that. And as was mentioned, we did get signatures, and I can tell you, as one of those who gathered signatures, there was very few people who turned it down, and well over 50% are residents inside the city limits. I personally counted or did addresses and compared them. So what I'm saying is what other people have said is you need to get the infrastructure in place. You need to get your codes in place. Saturday, twice I went from the east side to the west side of Woodland. I'm talking Saturday. It's not school time. It's not get out, go to work time. And the traffic was backed up to Ace twice in the morning and afternoon. This is Saturday. This used to be just school time or going to work time. It's just getting worse and worse. So we need to take care of all of our infrastructure, all the code things before you do anything to the urban growth expansion. And when you look at the map that was proposed at the Planning Commission, the light green that was the inclusion zone, not a single one of those wanted in, and that's what gives government a bad name. Is like one of the applicants had withdrawn. They had their attorney there, said we don't want in, and they get stuck in anyway. People just feel like, what's the use of going to government if they just throw us in anyway? None of these people asked, and it was done only to make it contiguous. Please, please, listen to the citizens. It's almost unanimous. Nobody wants this. Thank you.
Chris Conley? Okay. Is it Don Lofties? 634? No? Is it Houston? Mr. Ajo? No? Okay. Rick Haddock? Okay. Steve Madsen?
Good evening, Council. Steve Madsen, General Counsel, Ajo Construction. I don't really have too much to say tonight. We've submitted substantial written comments. Just want to let you know that we do have some of our development team here tonight to answer any specific questions you might have. I forgot my map. The only things we wanted to add to the Planning Commission recommendation, now, we are and we remain in favor of Alternative 5. That would be the option that went to the river. As the City Council knows all too well, there is going to be residential development happening down there, whether it's in the city or not. We think it's appropriate that the city be the planning entity for that area, and we would support that. Having said that, and given the Planning Commission recommendation, and Travis is familiar with the parcels that we're advocating for, we would advocate for inclusion of what we refer to as the WB parcel or the other Donald parcel. As you can see on the west side of the inclusion zone, there's sort of a flag that extends down there, and that runs contiguous with a 20-acre parcel that is also one of our applications. And that parcel is significant in a sense because it aids our design options given the topographical constraints that we have to work with there. So we would encourage inclusion of that. We would also encourage inclusion of the Dobe, never pronounced Benno's name right, parcel on the east side, which is right below where the Planning Commission recommended. It's approximately a 40-acre parcel. And again, would note that a lot of what we're talking about here, because of where we're at in time and process with the city's comprehensive plan, is we're talking about scale. And in order to achieve the kind of scale that it takes to both benefit the city's utility and infrastructure needs as well as our own, the more options that we have and the more planning that we can all do jointly together, the better. Having those options on both the east and west sides for expansion of those two additional parcels gives us some additional opportunities to plan with the city on things like sewer lines, water lines, that kind of infrastructure. So those would be our specific requests. Other than that, we're here to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Goddard, Mr. Madsen stated 2 different properties. Is that part of the, I know you marked one on here, additional Donaldson or Donald property. When we talk about the Dobie property, how far down does that include? Just so we're clear on what he's asking. So what would that line look like then? Okay, and then all the way over or just down?
No. So he asked for that one.
Okay.
Because it's contiguous with this.
Okay.
And then that one.
Perfect. And what happens about this stuff in between here?
That's one of the questions about
Okay.
should it be included or not.
Okay.
He said we need to talk about it.
Thank you. Mr. Doug Ferguson? Is it Matt or Mitt Peterson? Matt Peterson? Okay. Adam Littman? Yeah, that's, okay. Oh, perfect, thank you. Tyson Humbird?
Tyson Humbird. I live at 308 Wyman Road. I wasn't going to speak tonight, so I don't have nothing prepared, but bought that place out there, figuring I'd have it my whole life. This is the first time I thought I need to sell it and get out of there. You can't put all these houses out there in that area. As long as I'm there, I'm going to have animals. My neighbor's going to have animals, and we're going to be nothing more than bad neighbors if you put a subdivision out there. There's better things you can do with this area than stack houses in there like cordwood. That's not a good idea for that area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm thinking maybe. Kyle? I'll need you to state your name for me.
My name is Kyle Munio. I guess I don't have a whole lot to say either, other than I'm just a little more concerned with evacuation. I am a resident of the Woodland Bottoms now, and I'm not in the recommended area that the Planning Commission put forward. However, if there is development north of me, I would be concerned if there was ever issues with the dikes or an emergent evacuation that was put in the city of Woodland, how residents in the bottom would evacuate safely.
Thank you. Josh? I'm not quite sure how to say your last name.
Yeah, here he comes.
Okay. Ruman, thank you.
My name is Josh Ruman. I live at 245 Empress Lane. I am opposed to the development at the bottom of the hill, the Loomis addition. There's a 2-acre proposed annexation. I don't know if anyone's been down there to take a look at that. There's about a half an acre at most that's not in critical area. There's a lot of people up there that have low producing wells, and to take away any additional CARA, critical aquifer recharge area, would be detrimental or could be detrimental. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, the time is 7:42. That concludes our public comment portion this evening, and the council will now move into a workshop. All right, questions for Mr. Goddard at this time that you need clarified from his presentation, or questions that you may have brought forward after hearing public testimony? You want, go ahead.
Supposing that we choose to do nothing and add no additional areas to our urban growth boundaries, will that stop housing developments from occurring?
I think the answer to that is no. There is no way to ensure that no additional development will occur down there. I think the best example is the property owned by Ben O'Doby that was originally part of the application, included on the east side of South Pekin, down just below his greenhouse operation there. The county had approved an 18-lot, I believe it was an 18-lot, 2-acre subdivision, 2 acres each, and the placement or the relocation site for one of the industrial training facilities from out on the Columbia River was going to be approved, or was approved, to relocate down there. And they were part of the original application under Ajo's umbrella, but they withdrew those parcels, and they've since, they're working with Cowlitz County to explore a 76-lot residential subdivision down there. The area that's down there is currently unzoned, which means that any use that is not prohibited would be permitted down there. And I'd be the first to admit I don't know all of the nuances of the county code, but what that means is that you can have businesses like Geronimo Painting, Waltz Meats, White Timber Trucking, and Benno's operation. So whether it's agriculture or not, you can operate businesses down there. You can also do residential subdivisions. There are a total of 43 housing units south of the city. So just this one proposal alone would take it from 43 and add 76 to it. So it would almost triple the residential units that are down there south of town. And those have no city water, no city sewer, no city roads. So there is a possibility that development will occur regardless of whether the city plans for it or not. And as was rightly pointed out to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission discussed this, the fact that the city is looking at expanding the urban growth boundary could accelerate that application as people want to beat the city's requirements so that they could develop their property without necessarily having to meet city standards or pay the city impact fees that would be associated with being in the urban growth boundary or within the city. So in some sense, the genie is out of the bottle, but whether or not it can be put back in the bottle is a question that I can't answer. It would depend upon the individual property owner and whether they want to develop or not.
Can I follow up with a question? So Ms. Evans spoke this evening about impact fees. If that development were to go through, what would the city see as far as revenue and fees to help with our transportation impact? You just said that they were going to triple the housing units out there. What is the city going to be collecting to help mitigate that problem?
So if those 76 houses were to occur within the city, there would be impact fees for parks, school, transportation, and fire collected from those residences. So the impact fee for transportation is $838 per house. Fire impact fee is about $1,600 per house. For the school district, it's a substantial number. It's about $5,000 per house. So if that development were to occur in the county, the impact fees would be 0. If it were to incur within the city, the impact fees would be $380,000. And the school district, whether they use that $380,000 to pay off high school bonds, whether they use that to pay for additional capital improvements that need to be built or acquire land for future schools, that's money that the school district will not be able to collect if it doesn't occur within the city.
What's the size of lots if it does
so-
not come into the city? What's the size of lots that they're going to be able to build out there on?
So in some cases, it's 2 acres, in some cases, it's 5 acres, and in some cases, it's significantly higher. Mr. Doby is looking at ½ acre to 2 acres, depending upon, I'm assuming, the perkability of the individual lot because of the type of application that he has submitted. But for example, north of Empress Estates, I believe the minimum is 2 acres, and elsewhere in the bottoms, like between the railroad and the Columbia River, I believe it is 20-acre minimums, but don't quote me on that part.
So if he does it and it's not in the city, there's going to be fewer homes out there. But if it comes into the city, there's going to be a lot more homes out there, basically.
Potentially, yes. Now, I also have to be fair and point out that if the city expands the urban growth boundary and we do it as recommended by the Planning Commission, those houses will still occur in Cowlitz County because as Mr. Madsen, who represents Ajo, he pointed out that unless the city were to go with the original option 5, which basically says expanding the urban growth boundary all the way to the river on this side of the train tracks, then it would be in the city's urban growth boundary, and the city would be able to influence development in the county that occurs. If it's not in the urban growth boundary, the city has no say, which means we can't even influence anything that occurs. So it's possible that we could expand our urban growth boundary and we would still see hundreds and hundreds of residential units occur within Cowlitz County.
Does the city have the ability to be able to annex, or not annex, expand the urban growth boundary? When you talk about, maybe a two-part question here, and you talk about the influence part, does the city have the ability to call basically a timeout and say, we want to be able to look at lot size, we want to be able to look at the PERD, we want to look at our codes, we want to basically expand the urban growth boundary, look at those items, in addition to any others that come up, and basically say, let's do a timeout, a moratorium. Does the city legally have the ability to be able to do that if it were to move forward with expanding the urban growth boundary?
We do not, but one of the options that I recommended to you or I brought up to you in my presentation, and that is, you could always ask me to approach Cowlitz County and start the discussion about expansion of the urban growth boundary or amendments to their comprehensive plan. Whether or not a moratorium would be legal, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question, but theoretically in Cowlitz County, it would be the responsible of the county to decide whether or not they wanted to pursue additional development or not to pursue or not allow additional development. So I'm not sure that clearly answers your question, or did I leave you with more questions?
Well, it just creates more mud.
Yeah.
An additional question then I guess that I would have is, if you talk about the influence piece, because I really feel like, I guess in my mind, it seems to me like it's gonna happen. It's inevitable that you've got farmers who are wanting to sell their land. This is a prime example of that. They want to move, they want to not farm anymore. and so they want to sell their land. This seems to be like logically for them, what they want to do. And so it seems to me like we can influence it, or we cannot be a part of it at all. And we still get the impacts to the roads, the transportation, the services that are provided, police, fire. We get all of those impacts to the community with no cost or no revenue recognition to speak with this development that's going to occur.
Yeah, I think you have actually a pretty clear understanding of the implications of the decision you're talking about, because that is what you've said is actually very true. So let me give you some examples. For example, let's talk about school impact fees. And I know that the Woodland School District, approximately 50% of the students live within the city of Woodland. Approximately 14% live in Clark County, and approximately 36% live in Cowlitz County. So it's essentially approximately a 50-50 split. And assuming that the jurisdiction covered by the Woodland School District, that everybody pays the same maintenance and operation rate, so every taxpayer contributes to the school budget for maintaining the teachers and the facilities. The capital program, the improvement program, comes from separate levies and separate bonds. And for example, the bonds that are outstanding for the high school, they are spread throughout the entire jurisdiction, county, Clark County, Cowlitz County, and the city of Woodland. So that debt, assuming it's attributed equally across those jurisdictions, everybody, when you pay your tax bill, you pay off some of those those bonds. Mm-hmm. So now let's pretend that we have a new development in the city of Woodland, and they build a new house, and they pay impact fees in the amount of $5,000. It goes to the school district, and the school district can decide what it wants to do with those $5,000. And let's say it decides, okay, we're going to pay off some of the high school loan. We're going to pay some of that off early. So they put $5,000 down and pay off $5,000 worth of bonds. Now, the magic of the math says that the city taxpayers will save money because there's less debt that has to be serviced. But Cowlitz County and Clark County bond payers also see the benefit. So that $5,000, $2,500 of it pays off city debt, and $2,500 pays off county debt. So now, not only is everybody paying the same amount, but the city is or city residents, city developers are paying off a disproportionate amount of that debt because they're retiring Clark County and Cowlitz County resident debts at the same time. Whereas a house built in the bottoms, they don't pay the $5,000, so no city debt is retired. So it's not a quid pro quo, it is a one-way benefit from city development that helps pay off county debt. Does that make sense?
Which isn't that just a way of saying that the existing ratepayers are going to be paying for the growth or the impact that these additional homes are going to bring? In essence, isn't that?
Well, but in a sense, the existing ratepayers are not going to have to pay as much, and they're not going to have to pay as long because the debt is being paid down at a faster and faster rate.
But one might argue that the way you manage growth is through impact fees and through requirements, zoning requirements. It seems to me today that it's somewhat of a free-for-all down there, and you can do what you want.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. Now let's take a park impact fee, for example. If you build within the city, you would pay a park impact fee, which goes into the parks fund for you to do improvements at the park. It doesn't necessarily increase the amount of money that the average citizen pays into the park fund. But again, Cowlitz County and Clark County residents don't pay into the parks fund. But they still have the right to use the fund, or the park, they still have the right to attend Planners Day festivals, those kind of issues.
Can you talk a little bit about this, and if memory serves me correct, the 60-40 number was put together based upon the fact that we were not expanding our urban growth boundary. I think that's where that came from. Is that?
Anecdotally, I've been told that, but I have no way of verifying that.
Okay.
I can say that by focusing on multifamily development, we could achieve our growth target, but we would literally, due to the last 3 years' worth of single-family residential growth, we would essentially not be able to develop any more single-family residential without expanding our boundary. We would have to rezone the existing single-family residential property to to medium density, and we would have to encourage only multifamily development to achieve our 1,200 within our existing footprint.
So I would assume then, based on the presentation that you provided this evening, that the numbers were based on the 60-40, not the 75-25, or does that change it at all?
Unfortunately, it gets to a certain point where the mathematics of it doesn't work anymore. We would not be able to, even if we were to switch to a 75-25, we could not achieve our 1,900 or our 1,292 units within our existing footprint.
Mm-hmm.
We've almost passed that point of no return, the tipping point where we would still be able to sustain single-family residential without expanding our urban growth boundary, even at 75-25. Now, also, I need to point out that there's two ways to interpret the 75-25. If we had a new residential development come in and build 100 homes, the 60-40, the 25-75, if we were talking about applying it to new development, the new residential standard would be 25 multifamily and 75 single family, and you would be consistent with that policy. The other way to interpret this is across the entire community, we want to have 75% single family and 25% multifamily. So if we already have numbers that are like this, to get to this, we would only be able to build multifamily until we catch up, and then we would be able to start building single family again.
I have more questions, but I don't want to hog up the time.
Any other council member? Mr. Plaza?
I have some, but he can finish up and I'll bounce mine off.
And keep going? All right, Mr. Fredericks, keep going.
So I've been following Ridgefield's growth that they've bent having, and I've noticed that they don't have a lot of transportation infrastructure that's been put in place either. I guess it concerns me in my mind, this is coming whether or not we want it to or not. And that's why I'm having such a difficult time grasping this whole thing of this is going to happen, whether we like it. Now, how it happens, I think, is where we have some say in it. The traffic most likely will come later, but should be taken into consideration, I'm assuming, right? Correct?
Yes.
I'd like to see how you would do code to have burning, riding your tractor around horses. I'd like to know how I think that'd be interesting. Is there any particular zoning that you have that addresses that type of marrying the two of county and city together? Because
I think it's something that we would need to figure out what the county allows and whether or not it would be continued within the urban growth boundary. The 2002 resolution that the city and the county signed and adopted does say that when development occurs that the county will implement the city standards if it occurs within the urban growth boundary. Washington is also a right-to-farm state, and as you look, there is current agriculture within the city boundaries. So if you look at the Thoney Farm, that is still used for active agriculture, and it is within the city limits. There is nothing in the city code that would require somebody to stop performing agriculture. The other thing I need to point out, and that is, like, for example, Mrs. Seaman, she slightly confuses the terms of urban growth boundary versus within the city limits. So she might be within the umbrella of the recommendation for the Planning Commission, but she would not be within the city limits unless there was an annexation that brought her property in, at which time the city council would need to make a firm determination on whether or not they felt her property should be included with the city and covered under city ordinances or not. And so individual property owners, they could potentially be swept into annexations based upon the annexation laws, but typically the city doesn't proactively just arbitrarily annex people against their will. And so she may be able to continue agriculture under the county zoning in our urban growth boundary, and it wouldn't necessarily be affected or prohibited just because it's in our urban growth boundary.
Water and sewer capacity. Can you talk a little bit about that? If the council was to adopt what the Planning Commission has recommended, where does that put us on both of those?
Sure. So what I pointed out throughout this process is what you're being asked to discuss is not necessarily an addition to the county's or the city's capacity, because that decision was made in 2016 when the city already committed to adding X amount of industrial and commercial development and residential development. And so I can tell you from having read the comprehensive plan, it says that we have adequate water rights to serve what we have projected the growth. It also says that we have adequate treatment capacity before we require some additional changes or improvements at the treatment plant, but that's part of the water plan, and the sewer plan is the same way. So as you review those from year to year, you have this horizon, this moving horizon of, okay, it was 4 years out, 3 years from now, we're going to need an improvement, whether it's an additional storage tower up there near the treatment plant. You know that 3 or 4 years ahead of time, and so you're able to save money so that by the time 2022 rolls around, the money is in the account that allows you to build that. And then you also, as part of that, know when you're going to need to add the third line on the water treatment facility. Where that water is going to go hasn't been determined because we don't know where the development is going to occur. But the capital improvements are theoretically planned out and the capacity is there.
So the capacity there, I just want to jump in real quick because it goes back to what we were just discussing with the school, is that if this is in the urban growth boundary area, from what I understand, there's no impact fees, is what I just heard. But yet, if we're working on city infrastructure and we're building a water tower, we use impact fees in order to make that growth.
Yes.
So those that are using the service, who didn't pay for the service, actually the lion's share of the cost of that water tower is going to be on the residents that are currently here.
I don't know the mathematics of that, but I can tell you that you are currently going through a planning process for both the water and the utilities. And so I can't guarantee you that because I haven't been here long enough to know how you set your rates. But in theory, it is borne equally by existing users and expansion through development.
Within the city?
Within the city.
Just want to make clear.
Yes.
Thank you.
Just
go ahead.
So is it possible to get a map that includes, prior to Planning Commission's recommendations, what was being discussed? We have additional X's that were marked here on the flag. I guess it looked like a flag, and then the
Yes.
Ladoba
Yes.
property as well. If we
Yep.
could get that included and updated, that would be great. I will schedule a meeting with you because I would just really like to have an understanding of, I think we discussed influence. I'd like to understand that a little bit more. And so I don't think that's appropriate for here, but I will schedule some time with you in the future.
Sure.
Thank you.
And those maps are available in the March 28th, and the March 21st, and the February 21st Planning
Is it
Commission
possible
staff
we get them
reports.
printed out like?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mr. Plaza?
From what I've caught, throughout the presentation and comments and questions, some of this land is still county-owned, correct? Some of the land that you're looking at?
It's within the county jurisdiction, yes.
Right.
Yep.
So they're going to have the final say on whether anything gets built there or not?
Currently, yes.
Okay.
And we have no influence over that.
Right. So has there been any contact with the county as far as them giving us construction rights or anything like that to the land, or has nothing been reached out yet?
So we've been having conversations with them, but until essentially last week, we never really had kind of a firm vision of what we were going to proceed with as the city's proposal. So the Planning Commission has kind of finished their work, and they have a vision for what they're recommending that it comes to you.
Okay.
I will be using that to have a conversation, and actually our next one is scheduled for tomorrow. So we'll be working with DOT and the county tomorrow to have that discussion.
Okay, so then hypothetically, if I'm understanding right, we can all vote, hey, yeah, let's move forward and build, all these houses, but the county could still tell us no.
That is correct.
Okay, so that answers that question. Since this whole situation started, I've heard a whole bunch of different numbers being thrown out of how many homes are going to be built. I've heard anywhere from 4 to 600. I think 1,550 were thrown out there at some point. Can you give me a more solid estimated number of what we're looking at?
Okay.
Realistically.
So the county, or I'm sorry, the city comprehensive plan envisions within the next 20 years of 1,292 single-family residential, or of residential units. That's what's in our comprehensive plan using a 2.3% growth model. Now, the land that we have been discussing has a lot of different carrying capacities, because as I mentioned, we would not even need to expand the urban growth boundary, and we could build nothing but single-family or multifamily apartments, and we would be able to accommodate all 1,292 units without even expanding the boundary. Once you start talking about expanding the boundary, if you build single-family homes, our comprehensive plan calls for 4 units per acre. That's about 10,000 square feet per lot, maybe more. Once you exclude roads and wetlands, you're probably talking more about 7,500, 8,000 square foot lots. Similar to what you got in the neighborhoods like Blacktail and the new developments that have occurred on that side of town. But if we were to expand the urban growth boundary and only build multifamily, we could probably build 20,000 homes between here and the Lewis River. But again, that's not necessarily what we have enough water and sewer for. At this point, our planning horizon is 2.3% growth and about 1,292 units. So at some point, we can have applicants who might want to build more homes, but we just don't have the water or sewer or the transportation or the park or the school capacity to continue to say yes. That's the purpose of the planning process, for us to figure out how we envision that growth occurring.
Right, okay. So, but as far as people that have already put in applications or expressed an interest in building residence there, what number of houses are we looking at? I'm not looking like in the far future, I'm talking within the next couple of years.
Sure. So unfortunately, that's market driven. If a developer can build 50 units a home and sell 50 units per home per year, then that's the driving factor. If a large construction firm like one of the applicants, if they could build 500 homes a year and they can sell all 500 homes a year, then theoretically that's the market driven, which means that in 2 years at 500 homes a year, we will have to reevaluate our water and sewer capacity and find out whether it's the tail wagging the dog and we can't absorb that growth beyond 2 years. That's a market factor that we don't currently, we can't control.
Okay, but the point, not the point, but the answer I'm trying to get to is the newspaper reported that 600 new homes are coming in. I've heard word that 400 new homes are coming in, and then we've got, 490 here. What has been put on paper that X number of homes? I'm trying to get a number of what we're looking at here within the next year or two.
Unfortunately, there is no number for that.
Okay, so the 400 to 600 that's been reported is just guessing.
It's potential carrying capacity, but it is just guessing.
Okay.
It's
All
part
right.
of my planning modeling.
Okay, cool. Now, I know I've asked this before when this was first brought up last year, I think, as far as infrastructure. Obviously, a lot of people are here concerned about traffic, which they should be because our traffic here is horrible. If new homes come into this area out here on South Pekin, Wayland Road, that whole area, I'm guessing, obviously, new roads are going to have to be put in. What kind of road? Are we talking 2-lane roads, one way each way?
Well, if it were to occur within the city, or if it were to occur within the urban growth boundary, the city would be able to get road construction to the standard that the city has adopted for those roads. So it might be 2-lane, it might be 4-lane, curb, gutter, sidewalk. Those are typically the standards for a city street. Okay. If it were to occur in the county, it could occur at county standards. Now, their urban standard might have 2 lanes, it might have curb and gutter on one side, it may have sidewalks, it may not have sidewalks. I don't know. Then outside of the urban growth boundary, we wouldn't be able to influence what gets built.
Okay. And again, I'm repeating this question, but I'm kind of hoping the answer has changed. When these roads go through and are built for these new residences, at some point they're going to be going through somebody's property that's already owned. I am assuming that the city or the county or whoever is going to be building the roads will offer to pay people, for use of their land to put these roads through. If they choose not to allow that, what's the plan for continuation of the road along the plan that you've already got? So
the roads would not be built by the city or county. Theoretically, the developer would be responsible for constructing the roads that they're responsible for. So say, for example, at the south end of Pekin, if a development were to occur, they could be responsible for doing the improvements on their site and along their frontage. And it might transition, and I'm trying to think of a couple examples. Let's take Lewis River Road, for example. As you come into the city along Lewis River Road, you have sections where it pops out wide and there's a curb, gutter, and sidewalk, and then it necks back in, and then you'll go along a little farther and then it'll neck back out and there's curb, gutter, and sidewalk, because the development along that frontage built that. But the neighbor who hasn't redeveloped their property, they have not constructed those improvements. So that is pretty typical because the individual developer is only responsible for their frontage improvements. Now, improvements can only occur within right-of-way that has been dedicated for that purposes. So like in front of the schools, they will dedicate that right-of-way and make the frontage improvements when they build it. So the city wouldn't allow them to build it on private property. It would have to be dedicated right-of-way. So under no circumstances would the city just doesn't step in and finish the rest of Lewis River Road unless there's some kind of grant and partnership program where the DOT cover costs and the city cover costs. And this is illustrated by the current grant we have to install sidewalk along Lewis River Road from the intermediate school to the roundabout. That's a partnership with private property owners who are dedicating additional right-of-way, but the funding for the actual improvements are from grants and city funds, not the private property owner.
Okay, but I get that, but the question I had, well, I'll just jump back to last year. When I asked this question last year about roads going through private property, if the property owner didn't want to sell his land or give use of the land, I was told that eminent domain was an option. I'm trying to ask if that's still on the table or not.
It is an option. Jurisdictions always have the option of going through the path of eminent domain, but typically that's kind of the last resort because there are enough willing property owners who are interested in participating in partnerships that it's not typically done. Okay. But it is always an option for jurisdiction.
Okay, then just one last thing is, just let's going off the numbers that were reported in the paper. Let's drop, let's say 400 houses going within the next few years.
Okay.
You gave a household residency of 2.7 per house. Is that just adults or are you including children in that mix?
That's a statistic from the Office of Financial Management, and it doesn't break down. In some houses, it could be adults, in others, it could be one adult and 1.7 kids.
Right. Okay, yeah, the reason I was asking that is my concern as far as how a medium to a large number of homes is going to impact our schools with a sudden or rapidly, influx of new kids. Did the Planning Commission, did they report anything about that at all?
So we didn't get into that with the Planning Commission too much. I would assume that that was part of the discussion when they actually adopted the growth scenario back in 2015, 2016. The school district did come to some of these meetings, and they made a presentation and submitted some information into the record. And what they use is a statistical model that says for a single family home, on average, you might get 0.2 of a high school student, and you might get 0.15 of a middle school student, and you might get 0.3 of an elementary student. So if you build 100 homes, what that means is you're going to get 8 high school students and 12 middle school students and 32 elementary school students from those 100 homes. They then use that in their model that says, okay, if you build 200 homes, that's when you're going to need an additional elementary school, or we're going to have to take one grade out of the middle school and move it to the high school, and then we're going to take an elementary school grade and move it up. That's why they're constantly fiddling with how their school standards are structured based upon growth. Because what they don't do is build 2 elementary schools and then all of those kids, as they grow up, then they've got empty elementary schools and they need another middle school. So they have a model, and they're actually working through updating their capital facilities program to plan how those are going to occur. And they use our growth model to populate when they're going to need additional facilities.
Okay, yeah, the reason why I asked is I went to the schools and I spoke to administrators at the schools and asked how they thought that this was going to impact, what they've got going on there. The high schools told me that while they have room for growth, the new high school that they built, I think right now, if I remember right, he said they have about 680 students there. They're built for like 925. We were going off the 600 house number that was reported in the paper, so take it for what it's worth. I was told that if they get the amount of students that they were expecting from a community of that size, that while they could house them, they would end up needing to hire more staff, hire another assistant principal, close down their computer labs because they would need the added classroom space. And I was also told that the middle and the intermediate schools and the primary schools, that right now, we're pretty much at capacity, so they would need to build, which obviously means they would need the money to do that. Which, going by what it costs, and not counting the school buses, which I know cost over a couple $100,000 a piece. So I have a feeling that any impact fees we may get from a new community that's going to go to the school is going to be a drop in the bucket compared to what they're going to need if they have the influx of children that the schools are expecting. So I was just curious, if the Planning Commission hasn't considered that or looked into it in depthly, what's the plan?
Well, the school district, the school board is the one that actually does the modeling and figuring out how their capital program can prepare for growth. As I mentioned, the growth numbers that they use are informed by the city. And so, say for example, if the city opted not to change the urban growth boundary, or we opted not to do any of the redesignations, or if the city decided to do a building permit moratorium, the school district is still going to experience growth. And for example, the subdivision down in the bottoms, they're going to have an additional 75 residential or 76 residential units that's going to continue to grow. How they plan for those facilities isn't necessarily the city's responsibility, because in that case, all of the growth that's going to occur is not driven by the city. Just like we would have to continue to plan for those transportation impacts, even though we were not responsible for them.
No, I agree. It may not be our responsibility, but it will affect us, in ways that is. For example, if we get a, sudden increase in residential homes, our schools get busier, our traffic gets even worse. The police are going to get called to the school a lot more. They're going to have more areas where they get called for domestic violence and burglaries and everything else, which comes back to us, who have to fund the police department and make sure that they have the adequate manpower to be able to respond to these calls. And I mean, even if the county doesn't release some of that land to us and build houses there anyway, because of the agreements that law enforcement agencies have to one another, the sheriff's office has maybe 1-2 guys that patrol the south end, which is us, our area. If there's a call out there and their one guy is busy someplace else, Woodland's the one that get dispatched out there. So we need to make sure that we have the manpower that can respond to these calls to assist the county while still protecting our citizens, which again does come back to us because we fund them. So I think it's important for us to have all this information, whether it's our responsibility or not, before we make a decision that could negatively impact the police department, the fire department, and the city as a whole. So that's all.
Mr. Chapman.
Mr. Goddard, has the Planning Commission looked at, if we get this development, if we get this development and stuff in as we're going stuff, have we looked into what our safety factor, as in our police officer to a populace ratio, will get to? Because right now we're on a ragged edge. And if we get this much people in, how offset will we be?
There is a standard, and I'm trying to remember what it was. The police chief and I had a conversation with about it. I want to say it was 1 per 500 residents, and since there's about 5,500, I think our police department should be around 11 to 12. I'm not sure whether that coincides with the actual situation of the staffing. But for example, this did come up during the Planning Commission discussion, and typically, in a typical year, the City of Woodland Police Department responds about 5% of their calls end up in the county or on the state highway. And so budget-wise, it's about $140,000 per year of their budget goes to calls that are outside the jurisdiction. And the fire district is about the same thing. When Clark County Fire and Rescue ran the numbers for historically for Woodland, it was also about 5% call-outs outside of the city limits, and their budget, I think, was around $160,000 of their budget. That's what the portion recommends. Now, what that doesn't reflect is there are also times where there is a police officer calls for backup, and the first one to show up is a county sheriff. But since we don't pay the county sheriff's budget, I can't tell you what the number of how much they spend within the city limits. What I can tell you is city residents, when they pay their taxes, they pay city taxes. They also spend almost dollar for dollar amount of that tax money goes to the county. But county residents, when they pay their dollars to the county, none of that goes to the city. So in a sense, the city is paying for county sheriff services. Whether or not they're getting dollar for dollar return on that, I don't know.
I guess one of my question I'm looking at is, we talking about impact fees for schools, impact fees for roads and structures. Is there any way or anything that we can get impact fees and structures to help offset as this goes up? Do we equally keep our police force task in hand so we're not shorthanded and all of a sudden now we're 6 men short and we got to come up with $500,000 to get 6 more men going on the police force and stuff? We can't do it.
Yeah, there is not. Safety issues like that are not growth management covered, or there are no impact fees for those.
Can I clarify something?
Mr. Fredericks.
I just want to clarify, it was mentioned, the city is currently, the taxpayers of the city of Woodland are paying a 2% sales tax. 20% of that, I believe, that total dollar amount goes to the county. I'm not sure what, I'm assuming we use that to help them when they're covering us. But I know we do offer the same sort of service for them when they need it. So it goes back and forth. But I do know that the city, the taxpayers, that 20% of that number, Ms. Ripp, is that correct? Goes to the county, which we'd like to get back, but we don't currently.
The answer is no. Yeah. Mrs. Rounds.
I just have one comment, and it's me personally, but I'm not in favor of changing any commercial or industrial property to residential other than the little piece on Cherry Blossom, which makes sense for that piece, but that's my feeling, so.
Oh, Mr. Benjamin. My table's not curved, I can't see.
For reclarification, maybe, in those areas that would not be included in the urban growth boundary, it's likely that houses still will be built. And if they are, they still affect our traffic and our schools. And we have no say in how the roads are built, what kinds of services go in out there. If they are in our urban growth boundary, then we have say over how the roads are built, whether or not there's safe pedestrian traffic and sidewalks, how wide the streets need to be. We have basically total control over how those are built out. Is that correct?
So the term that I stay away from, and that is control. Okay. We have the ability to influence decisions that are made in the urban growth boundary, and that goes back to our 2002 resolution that commits the county to implement urban standards within the urban growth boundary. If it is not within the urban growth boundary, we are reliant upon the county to go above and beyond their code. If they were to request mitigation, it would have to be through SEPA. And voluntarily, developers can install urban level services, but that's completely voluntary.
Thank you.
Does that influence include the collection of impact fees?
Well, so in the case of, let's take the Ajo area that we're looking at, one of the controls, one of the actual controls that the city has, and that is the extension of our urban services like water and sewer. And typically, and I think this might be true, for example, on Waltz Meats, as part of their agreement to get water service, there is a clause in that agreement that says they agree to not fight annexation if and when it were to occur. That's pretty standard language if you do service outside of your growth boundary or outside of your city limits. So in that case, theoretically, the city could arbitrarily decide that once they get our water and sewer, you can annex them as you see fit. And so one of the things that I've been talking to Ajo about, and that is the city would want to annex them before they apply for their building permits. So that way we would be able to get the impact fees, even if the subdivision was approved in the county. Now, whether or not we could make that work timing-wise or whether we can legally require that is a question that might come down to the legal wording for any kind of developers or annexation agreement that were to, or connection agreement that were to occur.
So really, this could have occurred in 2016. We could have had this urban growth boundary discussion. What I think has created the issue now is that there's actually folks that want to develop this land. And that's really creating the, well, you know, whether or not we expand it or not. But it would seem to me that the sole purpose of the council in this decision, when we're making this decision, is to look at the future growth of Woodland and where do we think that growth is going to occur. And in conjunction with a comprehensive plan, take a look at, hey, do we have the numbers that we are going to need over the period of time between 2016 and 2036? As it is indicated in your presentation, I don't believe we have those numbers of residential available. So it would seem to me that that's what we're determining, whether or not we should be expanding our urban growth boundary. Having said that, I think it's equally important that if we're having discussions with the county, understanding what those discussions are, and that, because that to me is going to play would seem to me somewhat of a role in proceeding forward with these applications that have been or in the process of being either submitted or that we're discussing. So I'd be interested in understanding what those discussions are, and it would seem to me that those are going to be would be a major part of a policy decision, because it's not, again, you've used two adjectives to describe the process. You don't like the word control, but you like the word influence. But I'd like to have again, a clear understanding of what that means specifically, and how that all plays into it, because it would seem to me that based upon what the county is going to do, would play a major impact on the agreement portion of it when it comes down to the Ajo Construction 18005 and 18010, and whether or not also looking at the Doba property and the flag, the additional flag piece here. It would seem to me that that would be a major part of the discussion, and I feel like we're not having that discussion more open, and I'm not sure how to say it other than that. How do we engage the county in thoughtful discussion about how that looks?
That is a great question. And if you think back the 7 or 8 months ago when we started this conversation, my desire, let me back up a step before that. You brought up a really good point, and that is if we had made this decision back in 2016, before the current applicants were motivated to develop, there would have been a lot less pressure and there would have been a lot less urgency to this conversation. But we didn't, and so now we're here now. So the question is, do we make it under pressure, or do we put it off for a couple years to do some additional study and additional work and make it in 2 years based upon maybe there's less pressure then, or maybe there's more pressure then? I don't know, and that would be a great conversation for us to have, because 2 years ago we probably thought we were under pressure, but we weren't. This year we may think we're under pressure, but we may not be. 2 years from now it may be worse, not better. So that's a great philosophical question that I will leave it to you as the legislators to give me some advice on. So I'm sorry, get back to the question that you wanted to ask, and I'm sorry.
The county?
Train went off the tracks.
Having a discussion with the county of
Yes.
Shouldn't we be engaging them and having a discussion about
Yes, sorry.
what that looks like?
Yes. So up until this point, we've been having this conversation about, we're trying to frame what we need to be talking to the county about. Because when this process first started, I originally had said, let's not talk about the individual projects and spend a ton of time before we figure out what we're talking about. Let's back up and talk about the growth scenarios that the city would like to pursue. And scenario 1 was no changes whatsoever. We're just going to leave it the way we are, like we did in 2016. Scenario 2 is we were only going to look at the internal changes. Scenario 3 is we were going to look at each of the cases based upon its merits. Scenario 4 was we were going to accept all of the applicants, and that would be our planning horizon. Scenario 5 was we were just going to look at the bottoms all the way down to the Lewis River. And scenario 6 was the big honker where we're going to look at the entire bottoms and start planning for development that could occur on the entire bottoms. So those were kind of, I was trying to frame the conversation in terms of how does the city want to plan? And unfortunately, kind of through the process, all of those options dropped off, and we ended up with number 3, which is picking winners and losers, and that's the proposal that you have before you. It took us 8 months to figure out what we actually wanted to pursue, and now that we're here, the next step would be to go talk to the county about what we've ended up with. Whereas at the very beginning, if we had decided, okay, this is the scenario we want to pursue, that's a totally different conversation.
Okay, so let's suppose the policy decision is made that we're not going to do anything. We're just going to, maybe we need a plan, redo the code, look at all that. You got 2 years to do it, whatever. Put a magic number on it. But nothing stops me from getting an application with the county, moving forward, and guess what we're stuck with? We're still stuck with the impacts of traffic, the impacts to schools, the impact to public services. We get all of that. So is there something that the developer is not wanting to move forward with doing that because of the cost associated with putting in their own infrastructure? It would seem to me that
No, I don't necessarily see that as a motivation for them. I think in some sense, a developer like Ajo would like a clear direction so that they understand what their risk is and they understand what their responsibility is. It makes life a lot easier for them. to be honest, at this point, they could be extremely frustrated because we've been going through this process and we're just theoretically getting to the starting line of the conversation with the county. So the idea that they're pushing this along because they can get in and get something for free that they wouldn't have got otherwise, I don't know that I necessarily subscribe to that, because to this point, they haven't gotten anything.
But the county's not going to stop them. I mean, I don't foresee, I have a piece of property, I bought it for an intended use, I'm gonna use it. And people can say whatever they wanna say, but it's coming. The county would most likely be required to allow it.
Yeah, that is entirely true. So you could give me direction that says you're not gonna make any changes, and my marching orders are for me to go pursue a master plan for the entire bottoms. And my responsibility for the next 2 years is to work with the county and take on planning in the entire bottoms. That comes with some dangers because, as you mentioned, 200 houses could occur in the county, and there's no way for us to get that, to hold back that wave of development that could occur in the county. We can't even influence that. On the other hand, we could go to the county and request them to install a moratorium that says they wouldn't entertain new developments, but I don't know whether they would be willing to entertain that. So they may be perfectly willing for the city to spend its money on master planning the bottoms, because A, it's done for free, and B, the city's gonna pay for it, and D, we're gonna engage the county citizens to do city planning. You know, they might be absolutely open to that, in which case we have to spend our resources planning for the county. And in the end, you might get something that you don't like, in which case we're back to the situation where we have to decide what are we going to do with our urban growth boundary, because the county, the product from that effort is not acceptable to you as the council.
At some point, I would think that it would be appropriate for a letter to be written that is signed by this council engaging the county in a discussion about this, because we're both into this, and I'm not sure that that's been done. So I think that might be an appropriate next step, and I don't even know how you would. Don't ask me to write the letter. I can give you an idea of what it might say, but I think that would be important to know. I guess that's all I have to say. But I wanted to bring up the Woodland Commerce Center, and this is a completely different one. Can you explain what the Planning Commission's thought was on the PERD requirement for that specific? This is 2018-012 Woodland Commerce Center.
Sure. So the applicant in that case is requesting a change from commercial to residential. They have a currently approved commercial site development, or a commercial site plan on that property. And the portion along the waterfront, they have been unable to put together the tenants for the building that have warranted the commercial development. So they came up with a preliminary plan for I believe it was 43 units of residential and condominium style along the shoreline. And as Skip Erling mentioned, that it is the only, well, it is on the shoreline, which requires shoreline or review under the Shoreline Management Act, which has an extra level of regulation that don't occur on any of the other projects that we're looking at. When I was going through the initial round of reviews on each case, there is a policy in the comprehensive plan that says we would like to encourage more planned unit residential development. Therefore, if an applicant requested residential standards, I put in there that there is a policy that supports this. Therefore, the Planning Commission should consider a planned unit residential development as the standard for development on that property. The comprehensive plan doesn't say you shall, And the purpose of the planned unit residential development that was brought up by several of the applicants, and that is to increase densities and allow for smaller lots at a higher density, which is consistent with the comprehensive plan, and mixed types of housing units within the city that is consistent with the comprehensive plan. But as the applicant has argued, and that is, they're not necessarily looking for higher densities. They're not trying to put in 300 units. They're trying to put in 43 units, which is actually lower density and a housing density that is not currently available within the city. So their argument is that with the planned unit residential development, we're pushing them out of the style they would prefer into a higher density, higher intensity development that could occur. What the Planning Commission felt was, because it is a shoreline and the Shoreline Management Act encourages open space and access to the water, that they felt a PURD with its higher standards for residential or for recreational access, that the two would be compatible to ensure that there is public access to the pathway along the shoreline.
Well, encourage and shall are very two different words. I think we left it open. We'd like to encourage them, but it's not what I want to use my land for. So it just seems to me that if the Planning Commission forwarded that recommendation to us with a requirement, is that what I understand? That
A requirement for a PURD, that is correct.
Okay. The existing PURD ordinance that is currently in the city of Woodland. That's what they would be.
That's
held to.
correct.
Okay. Nothing prevents us from removing that requirement from the approval. Is that correct?
That's
as well?
correct.
I thought so. Okay, thank you.
And the current site plan on that site, they have dedicated, or there is shown public right-of-way for people to walk along the river. And so it is currently part of the proposal, and they've indicated that they would keep that. So their argument is, we're requiring additional process to get something that we've already been offered. So therefore, it's unnecessary.
If you make that a walkway there, it would increase the saleability of what you're trying to sell, in this case condominiums, because you have that ability to be able to walk and enjoy the river. Wow. I mean, so, okay. Thank you.
All right, seeing no more questions, it's 8:49. Council has on their docket for a potential meeting on Monday, I don't have any of my stuff in front of me here, the 29th. Does council want to, and then the next portion, that would be May 6th, to take action and discuss once more. Does council need another meeting on the 29th as a workshop to continue discussing the applications, or are you ready to move forward to May 6th?
I'm ready to move forward to May 6th.
May 6th.
I'll let you think for a minute. Okay. I'm seeing a consensus that no further workshop is needed on the 29th at this point. Okay.
So does that, I just
go
want to
ahead.
clarify, does that include not engaging the county in discussions prior to action when we take action on the 6th? Is that what we're saying here as a group? I'm just curious.
We can't meet with the county or talk with the county till we have a plan to hand them, for them to work with us. Is
Mr.
my
Goddard, is
understanding.
that, did I misunderstand? We would have to wait until we actually, we don't have any options to have a discussion with the county currently based upon what is in front of us? Which, based on your four, I don't know, there were 4 options.
Well, you can direct me to work with the county on anything you see fit. But whether or not I'd be able to get it completed before the 6th is a whole nother issue.
Sure.
Right.
Because I can start the conversation, but it may take months to hammer out some kind of formal agreement.
Okay.
And we're also just half of the equation. The county council may have their own timeline and concerns.
And that's fair. And how do we address the 75-25 issue on the 6th? I would seem to think that that would be something that you would need guidance on before we get to the 6th, or we can do that on the 6th.
So the one thing that I need to point out, and unfortunately Frank's not here tonight to give you any legal advice, you'd need to ask him that separately, is you can make changes to the comprehensive plan under the Growth Management Act once a year. So if you were to decide on the 6th that that was all you were going to take action on, everything else by necessity would drop off the table until the next round of comp plan updates. So you will have to come up with some kind of comprehensive plan for how you want to handle the maps, and the policy changes or text amendments would be part of that discussion. So it may get to the 6th and you come up with a 3-month continuance while you want A, B, C, and worked on, which is, so you kind of table it until you can get more answers and then take action.
So let me ask you this, Mr. Goddard, then, as I'm looking at this map here, because it sounds like a lot of discussion is on the outside of the city. So on the 6th, council could theoretically make decisions on applications with inside the city and say, we want to discuss this further with the county, and that would be the decision for the year. And then it would start again, the conversation would start again after the county was somewhat on board with those discussions, moving forward with council, or with the city of Woodland and Cowlitz County.
Yes. So you could also roll in any policy changes that you would like in the comprehensive plan at the same time as part of the internal. Okay. The one thing that I would need, and that is some clear direction on what you would like me to talk to the county about. Because again, if you want me to have a conversation with them about master planning the bottoms, that's a different conversation than if we're just talking between the Lewis River and the train tracks, or between Wyman and the city, or if we're only going to talk about the Burke area, the Burke Road expansion. Again, that's a relatively shorter, easier conversation because it doesn't involve the bottoms. So if you're going to go that route, I'm going to need some specific direction about what you'd like me to negotiate.
How does some of the things that were brought up this evening and through the Planning Commission process was code revision? Before expansion happens, the code needs to be revised. Is that also part of that conversation with the county of, if I'm looking at this and council decided not to move south and to wait, due to the fact that our transportation plan is still coming for 21, they want codes revised, they want X, Y, and Z on there. How does that play into that conversation as well?
The most passionate conversation with the Planning Commission was about they would really like to see the city pursue asking the county to implement an urban holding district on the bottoms. So in other words, is the county willing to just throw out a 40-acre lot minimum throughout the entire bottoms until we master plan? Or maybe it's just between the railroad and the Lewis River. So the area that we've been talking about south of town, throw out a 40-acre minimum, and that way it will prevent the 76 lots here and the 12 lots there and the 100 lots there. But that would require the county to make the decision that they want to change their comprehensive plan to include that. And they just went through the process a couple years ago of doing the 5-acre small holder. And so the county may be willing to only approve 5-acre lots, but again, do you want to face urban growth expansion discussions faced with 5-acre lot minimums, because each one of them is going to argue, well, I bought my 5 acres with the idea that it's not part of the city, and therefore.
We had one resident here that said that they only have 1 acre. So how does that would affect that property at that point then? Okay.
Again, I don't know whether we can put that genie back in the bottle.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Anything further from council at this point, or any direction for Mr. Goddard for the meeting on the 6th? All right, seeing nothing else, we're out of workshop. It's 8:56. Thank you. Thank you for coming, everybody. We appreciate it.